A loud, shrill scream shattered the calm of Maplewood-gated community. "Excuse me, you can't park there." It was the kind of voice that sent shivers down spines, a sound that made even birds pause mid-chirp. The paramedics barely had time to step out of the ambulance before a furious woman came storming toward them, her pastel cardigan flapping like a battle flag. Karen Wilkins, the self-proclaimed enforcer of the HOA, was on the warpath. The ambulance had just pulled into the neighborhood, sirens wailing, lights flashing, urgency dripping from every moment. Inside one of the modest houses, a man named Tom Jacobs lay unconscious, his wife Sarah pacing in panic, praying the emergency responders would arrive in time. But now, their lifeline was being delayed by something far worse than traffic. A raging HOA Karen. "That is my parking space," Karen screeched, her arms flailing as she pointed an accusatory finger at the ambulance. "I don't care what your excuse is. Move it, now." One of the paramedics, Marcus, a veteran in the field, had seen his fair share of chaotic situations. He'd dealt with panicked family members, aggressive bystanders, and even uncooperative patients. But never a woman demanding an ambulance move during an active emergency. "Ma'am," he said firmly, wasting no time. "This is a medical emergency. Step aside." Karen planted herself directly in front of the vehicle, arms crossed like a bouncer at a club she had no business running. "I don't care who is having an emergency," she snapped. "We have rules in this community, and that truck is violating them. If I let this slide, what's next? Fire trucks on the grass, police cars blocking our gates. We have standards, and I expect them to be followed." Inside the house, Sarah's panic turned to desperation. Through the window, she could see them arguing. Why weren't they coming inside? What was happening? Her husband needed help. Now. Marcus clenched his jaw. Every second wasted arguing with this lunatic was a second stolen from the man inside. His partner, Lisa, wasn't waiting for permission. She grabbed the emergency kit and started moving toward the door. Karen gasped. "Oh no, you don't." She physically stepped in front of Lisa, blocking the way. Lisa, a no-nonsense woman who had been doing this job for over a decade, gave her a look that could have melted steel. "Ma'am, move." "Not until that ambulance is out of my spot." Marcus exchanged a look with his partner. This was insanity. They had handled life and death situations daily, but they had never been in a position where the biggest threat wasn't a medical condition. It was a suburban dictator with a clipboard. Then Karen pulled out her phone. "That's it. I'm calling the police." Marcus exhaled sharply. She wouldn't. Oh, but she would. She turned away dramatically, stabbing at her phone screen, and pressed it to her ear. She was calling 911. On an ambulance. "Yes, hello. I'd like to report an illegally parked vehicle," Karen announced, pacing back and forth as if she were handling high-level negotiations. There was a pause on the other end. "Could you clarify what kind of vehicle, ma'am?" Karen rolled her eyes, exasperated. Why were people so incompetent? "An ambulance." Silence. Then, "I'm sorry, did you say an ambulance?" "Yes," Karen snapped, "and it is completely blocking my property. I have told them to leave and they are refusing. This is a direct violation of HOA parking regulations, and I need someone to remove it immediately." The dispatcher was silent for a moment, probably trying to process whether they were actually hearing this correctly. "Ma'am, is the ambulance responding to an emergency?" Karen groaned loudly, throwing a dramatic hand in the air. "How is that relevant?" Inside the house, Sarah was on the verge of tears. She pressed her hands against the window, pleading in her mind for someone, anyone, to make this nightmare stop. Her husband, her world, lay unconscious on the living room floor, his breath shallow, his skin pale. She had already lost precious minutes waiting for help. And now, outside, a woman was arguing over a parking space. Marcus and Lisa weren't going to wait any longer. If Karen wanted to waste her time calling the cops, fine. They had a life to save. They pushed past her and rushed inside. Karen, now fuming that she was being ignored, stomped her foot like a child throwing a tantrum. "Oh, this is not over," she shrieked into the phone. "They are disobeying community rules, and I want someone out here immediately." The dispatcher took a deep breath. "Ma'am, emergency vehicles are legally permitted to park wherever necessary during an active emergency. They are not required to adhere to HOA regulations." Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "So you're refusing to send an officer?" The dispatcher, likely resisting every urge to hang up, replied, "I will. Notify a unit." Karen grinned triumphantly. "Good." She hung up and turned toward the growing crowd of neighbors, who were now watching her like she had just set fire to a puppy shelter. "Can you believe this?" she barked at them. "This is what happens when you let people think they're above the law." The only response was the shaking of heads and hushed murmurs. Karen Wilkins had done a lot of terrible things over the years. She had fined people for leaving their trash bins out a minute too long. She had tried to ban holiday decorations because she found them visually offensive. She had issued citations to children for playing too loudly. But this? Calling the cops on an ambulance? This was a new low, even for her. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights appeared at the entrance of the neighborhood. A police cruiser pulled up next to the ambulance, and out stepped Officer Daniels, a man who had dealt with every flavor of entitled citizen over his years on the force. He took one look at Karen, the ambulance, and the crowd of horrified neighbors, and sighed. He already knew this was about to be the dumbest call of his career. Karen practically skipped toward him, her smug expression radiating self-importance. "Officer, finally! I have been harassed, disrespected, and ignored by these so-called medical professionals. I demand you remove their vehicle from my property this instant." Daniels stared at her for a long moment. Then, in the most deadpan voice imaginable, he said, "You called 911 on an ambulance." Karen folded her arms. "Yes, and I stand by it." Daniels took a slow, deep breath, likely resisting the urge to launch himself into another dimension to escape this conversation. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "a man is inside, having a medical emergency, and you want me to ticket or tow the vehicle that is saving his life?" Karen didn't hesitate. "Well, yes." Daniels blinked. Then, after a long pause, he spoke loud enough for the whole street to hear. "I have been a cop for 15 years, and this might be the dumbest complaint I have ever responded to." The street erupted in laughter. Karen's smug confidence shattered, and she had no idea this was only the beginning of her downfall. Karen's fingers fumbled over the screen of her phone as she started a live stream, her breath coming in short, indignant huffs. She was going to expose this injustice. The world needed to know how she, a respected HOA board member, was being disrespected by these so-called heroes. "Hello, my fellow homeowners," she began, forcing a sweet but strained smile. "It's Karen Wilkins, and I am here to show you all the absolute disregard for community rules happening in our beloved neighborhood." She flipped the camera to the ambulance, parked defiantly in her reserved spot. "This vehicle," she hissed, "is parked illegally. I asked them nicely to leave. I called the authorities, and yet they're still here, acting like our HOA rules mean nothing." The comment section lit up almost instantly. "You called 911 on an ambulance? This has to be satire, right? Please tell me this woman isn't real. Karen, go touch grass." Karen ignored the flood of negativity and kept ranting. "This is why we have rules," she said, voice rising. "If I let this slide, what's next? Fire trucks blocking driveways? Police officers ignoring our guest parking policies. This is a slippery slope, people. From the sidewalk, her neighbor Jake let out a dry chuckle. Karen, do you hear yourself? You're actually calling first responders rule breakers while they're trying to save someone's life. Karen spun toward him, eyes flashing. You don't understand, Jake. If we let chaos take over, this community will crumble. Jake snorted. Oh yeah, I'm sure Maplewood gated community will collapse because an ambulance parked in your precious spot for 10 minutes. The comment section wasn't getting any kinder. Lady, take the L and go inside. You are the villain of the internet today. This is why aliens don't visit us. Karen's confidence faltered just slightly as she saw the wave of criticism rolling in, but she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. They would see. One day, they would all thank her for keeping things in order. Then the police siren sounded again, and she smirked. Finally, someone with authority would handle this. Officer Daniels stepped out of the patrol car, now forced to deal with another ridiculous HOA complaint. He adjusted his belt, surveyed the scene, and immediately looked exhausted. Who called this in? Karen rushed toward him, her phone still held high. I did, officer. Thank goodness you're here. You need to remove that vehicle immediately. Daniels stared at her. You called 911 on an ambulance, he said flatly, for what felt like the 100th time. Yes, Karen snapped, placing a hand on her hip. And they refused to leave. This is a blatant HOA violation, and I want you to issue a citation or have them towed. Daniels inhaled slowly. So, let me get this straight, he said. A man is inside, possibly dying, and you want me to… Yes, Karen interrupted, because the rules don't bend for anyone, officer. Not even for… Daniels held up a hand. Let me stop you right there. I'm going to be honest, ma'am. I have heard some wild complaints in my time, but this… He shook his head. This one takes the cake. Behind him, Jake burst out laughing. The neighbors murmured in agreement, some filming, some just shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen's smug expression started to crack. I am an elected HOA official, she stammered. You cannot speak to me this way. Daniels crossed his arms. Ma'am, you're an HOA member, not law enforcement. You don't get to interfere with an active emergency. Karen's face turned red. Well then, fine them. Daniels arched an eyebrow. You want me to issue a citation to paramedics for parking during a medical emergency? Yes, she snapped. Silence, then a chuckle, then full-on laughter. The neighbors couldn't hold it in any longer. People doubled over, clutching their stomachs, tears forming in their eyes. Jake was practically wheezing. Karen's face twisted in fury. This is not funny, she shrieked. This is an abuse of power. Daniels shook his head. No, ma'am. What you just did is a misuse of emergency services. And honestly, you should be grateful I'm not citing you for it. Karen gasped, scandalized. You wouldn't dare. Daniels shrugged. Keep pushing your luck, and we'll see. The HOA emergency meeting was held the very next evening. For the first time in years, the Maplewood Community Center was packed. People who had never once attended a board meeting suddenly showed up, eager to witness what would undoubtedly be the greatest downfall in HOA history. Karen marched in, her heels clicking against the polished floor, a thick binder of rules clutched tightly in her hands. She had spent the entire night preparing, searching for every loophole, every technicality that could save her. She refused to be taken down by a bunch of ingrates who didn't understand how important she was to this neighborhood. As she reached the front, she immediately addressed the board. Before we begin, she announced, I would like to make a formal statement. Langford, the HOA president, sighed, but gestured for her to proceed. Karen cleared her throat, flipping open her binder. What happened yesterday was a gross misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by social media hysteria and unfair public perception. Jake coughed loudly. You mean the part where you called 911 on an ambulance? Scattered chuckles rippled through the crowd. Karen shot him a glare before continuing. I was merely following protocol, which, might I remind you, is the foundation of this board's existence. We are here to enforce the rules, not disregard them when it's convenient. Langford exhaled. Karen, we all saw the footage. Karen slammed her binder shut. That footage was taken without my consent. I demand it be removed immediately. Jake snorted. Yeah, that's not how the internet works. The audience laughed again. Karen's nostrils flared. Langford shook his head. This isn't about footage. It's about whether or not you should remain on this board. Karen scoffed. You can't remove me. I was elected. Langford nodded. Yes, and now we're voting on whether to unelect you. For the first time, Karen's confidence wavered. Langford turned to the room. All in favor of removing Karen Wilkins from the HOA board, effective immediately. Every single hand shot up. Karen gasped. No, you can't. Langford nodded. Motion passes. Effective immediately, Karen Wilkins is no longer an HOA board member. The room erupted into cheers. Karen looked around wildly, hoping, praying for someone to take her side. But not a single person did. Her reign of terror was over. Jake smirked. Well, Karen, looks like you're just another regular resident now. Karen's lip trembled. This isn't over, she hissed. You'll all regret this. Jake leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head. Oh, I doubt that. Karen stormed out of the community center, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. How dare they? How dare they strip her of her authority, humiliate her in front of the entire neighborhood, and act like she was the problem? She had given years to Maplewood gated community. She had sacrificed weekends, spent countless hours issuing citations, writing up reports, and keeping this place in order. And this was how they repaid her. It was outrageous. It was disgusting. As she marched toward her car, still fuming, a new nightmare unfolded before her eyes. A tow truck was parked directly in front of her driveway. A tow truck. The driver, a burly man in a grease-stained uniform, leaned against the door of his truck, flipping through paperwork. He glanced up, recognizing the name on his clipboard. You Karen Wilkins? Karen stopped dead in her tracks, eyes narrowing. Yes, why? The driver tapped his clipboard. Yeah, I'm here to tow your car. Her brain short-circuited. She blinked, staring at him like he had just spoken a foreign language. Excuse me? The driver sighed. He had been doing this job long enough to recognize the Karen energy radiating off this woman. Says here you got outstanding HOA fines. Looks like multiple violations. Karen's jaw dropped. That's impossible, she snapped. I was on the HOA board. I issue fines. I don't get them. The driver shrugged, flipping through his papers. Well, you're not on the board anymore, lady. And according to these records, the fines weren't voided. Looks like they've been piling up for a while. Karen's breath hitched. What fines? She demanded, snatching the clipboard from him. She skimmed the list, her stomach twisting into knots as she read the infractions. Leaving Christmas decorations up past the HOA deadline. Unauthorized garden gnome placement. Failure to properly trim hedges. Excessive use of unapproved mailbox color. Karen's eye twitched violently. A garden gnome violation. Her own rules, her standards, the very system she created, had turned against her. She shook her head frantically. No, 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 this is wrong. These fines were never meant for me. I was the one making sure other people followed the rules. Jake, standing on his porch with his arms crossed, grinning like an idiot, called out, "Oh, this is poetic." A few neighbors were gathered around, whispering, filming, watching Karen's downfall in real time. Karen whirled back to the driver. "This is a mistake. I will pay the fines right now." The driver shook his head. "Gotta go through the HOA office. Payments have to be processed before a tow request is cancelled." Karen's pulse skyrocketed. "But they just kicked me off the board." The driver gave her a slow, almost amused nod. "Yeah," he said. "That's tough." Karen screeched in frustration and lunged toward her car, throwing herself onto the hood like a soap opera villain. "You can't do this," she wailed. "This is theft. I will sue." The driver didn't even react. He just turned to Officer Daniels, who was sipping coffee nearby, watching the scene unfold like a casual spectator at a football game. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, maybe it's time to take the L and go inside." Karen shrieked. "No, I have rights. This is illegal. Someone call the police." Jake burst out laughing. "Karen, you did call the police. He's standing right there." Karen was too blinded by rage to process the humiliation. The driver tapped his watch. "Look, lady, you got two choices. Move, or I tow the car with you on it." For a moment, it seemed like Karen might actually test him. Then, realizing she had zero leverage, she peeled herself off the hood, trembling with fury, humiliation, and sheer disbelief. She took a shaky breath, eyes burning with rage. "You will all regret this," she hissed. Jake, still grinning, leaned forward. "Oh, I doubt that." The tow truck roared to life. Karen's beloved Lexus SUV was lifted off the ground, carried away like a fallen soldier in a war she had just lost. Her empire was crumbling before her eyes. And the worst part? It was only getting started. Karen locked herself inside her house that night, shutting all the blinds, refusing to go outside, ignoring the endless stream of HOA emails, social media notifications, and texts from former board members who were now distancing themselves from her like she was radioactive. But no amount of silence could save her from what was happening online. Her entire meltdown had been caught on film, clipped into segments, edited, and uploaded to every social media platform imaginable. It was everywhere. HOA Karen gets owned after calling 911 on an ambulance. Entitled woman tries to stop EMTs. Gets instant karma. When HOA power goes too far. And the comments? Brutal. She really thought HOA rules were above city laws. This is why nobody likes HOA people. I wish I lived in this neighborhood just to see this in person. The cherry on top? Someone remixed her rant into a full-on auto-tuned song. The internet had transformed her into a meme. Her face, twisted in anger, screaming about community rules, while an ambulance sat behind her, was now a reaction image. Her voice shrieking, "You can't park here, I don't care who's dying," was now a viral soundbite. Even news stations had picked up the story. She flipped through channels, horror growing as she saw herself on national broadcasts. An HOA board member who called 911 on an ambulance. An outrageous abuse of HOA authority. People are now demanding reform for HOA power across the country. Karen clutched her head. This was a nightmare. A never-ending, spiraling, inescapable nightmare. And then, as if the universe wanted to make extra sure she knew just how bad things had gotten. Her phone rang. She snatched it up, desperate for good news, only to see the caller ID. It was Mr. Langford, the HOA president. Karen swallowed hard and answered. "What?" she snapped. Langford sighed. "I just got off the phone with legal," he said. "Given Everything. We need to have a discussion about your future in this community. Karen stiffened. What does that mean? Langford exhaled slowly. The board is meeting to discuss whether or not we should begin the process of revoking your residency. The words hit her like a truck. What? You can't do that. I bought this house. You signed HOA agreements, Karen, Langford said, his voice tired. And there's a clause about disrupting community harmony. Karen's blood ran cold. She had written that clause herself, and now it was about to be used against her. Karen barely slept that night. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with 100 different ways to salvage her reputation. Damage control. That's what she needed. A way to turn this around, make herself the victim of some grand conspiracy, maybe even gain sympathy from a few weak-minded neighbors who still feared her. She was Maplewood. She built this community. And now they wanted to erase her? Number not happening. By the time the sun rose, Karen had crafted a plan. She would march into that HOA emergency meeting, demand her respect, and make them regret ever turning against her. She threw on her best power suit, pinned her HOA badge to her blazer, because in her mind she was still the real leader of this community, and stormed out of the house. She expected silence, fear, people lowering their gazes when she walked past. Instead, she was met with laughter. The entire street was buzzing with neighbors standing in clusters, chatting, celebrating. It looked like a block party. People who had never spoken to each other before were now standing side by side, drinking coffee, bonding over their shared joy, over her downfall. A group of kids played basketball in a driveway, an activity Karen had previously banned for being too loud and disruptive. Someone's dog ran across a front yard without a leash. Another rule she had enforced. A garden gnome, one of the very decorations she had outlawed, sat proudly on a neighbor's porch, painted in bright neon colors just to spite her. Karen's eye twitched. They weren't just ignoring her rules, they were celebrating their freedom. She clenched her fists and marched forward. They wanted a war. Fine, she would give them one. Inside the community center, the room was packed. Every seat was filled. Residents lined the back wall, standing shoulder to shoulder. It was the biggest turnout the HOA had ever seen. At the front of the room, HOA President Mr. Langford sat with the rest of the board members, looking tired but resolute. Karen made a beeline for the microphone. I demand to speak, she announced. Langford didn't even look surprised. He just gestured for her to go ahead. Karen stepped forward, straightening her spine, adopting the tone of someone giving an important presidential address. What happened to me, she began, is nothing short of an unjust character assassination. Jake, sitting in the front row, muffled a laugh. Karen ignored him and continued. I was merely upholding the standards that keep our community clean, organized, and respectable. And now, because of one overblown incident, I am being villainized. Langford sighed. Karen, you called 911 on an ambulance. Karen lifted her chin. I was protecting our community's regulations. You blocked medical professionals from saving a life. Karen's lips tightened. And yet somehow, she pressed on, I am the one being punished. The crowd burst into laughter. Karen's face burned. Langford shook his head. This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. And right now, we're here to discuss whether you should even be allowed to remain in this neighborhood. Karen's breath hitched. That's insane. You can't vote me out of my own home. Langford sighed again. Karen, you signed an HOA agreement, and one of the clauses you pushed for says that a resident can be removed if they create an environment that is… What's the exact phrasing? A board member flipped through a folder. Hostile, disruptive, or damaging to the well-being of the community. Langford nodded. Right, and over the past 48 hours you've done all three. Karen's blood ran cold. Jake grinned. Damn, hoisted by your own petard. Karen turned red. You can't do this. Langford gave her a pointed look. All in favor of beginning the process to revoke Karen Wilkins's residency? A sea of hands went up. Karen's breath caught. No, you can't. All opposed? Langford asked. Silence. Not a single hand was raised. Karen staggered back. This is a witch hunt, she screeched. Langford ignored her. The motion passes. We will begin legal proceedings immediately. The crowd erupted into cheers. Neighbors high-fived, people clapped, some even popped open celebratory drinks. Karen felt the walls closing in. Everything she built, everything she controlled, gone. She turned wildly to the audience, her voice shrill with desperation. You need me, she shouted. This neighborhood will fall apart without me. From the back of the room, someone called out, Nah, we're good. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Karen's chest heaved. They were mocking her, dismissing her. It wasn't just a loss. It was public execution. Her legacy was ruined. Jake stood up, still recording. So, Karen, how does it feel to get kicked out of your own dictatorship? Karen let out an inhuman shriek. She grabbed her folder, slammed it shut, and stormed out of the room. The crowd cheered even louder. It was over. Karen had lost. The next morning, a moving truck was spotted outside Karen's house. Jake sat on his porch, sipping coffee, watching the glorious scene unfold. Karen stormed out, her hair disheveled, her face red with rage, directing the movers like a general preparing for battle. But there was no victory left for her. There was no more power. She had been exiled. As she threw a box into the back of the truck, she spotted Jake watching her. She marched toward him, eyes blazing. You think you've won? She hissed. You think this neighborhood will be better without me? Jake smirked. Oh, I know it will be. Karen's nostrils flared. You'll regret this. You all will. Jake leaned forward, grinning. Karen, the entire internet saw you lose your mind over a parking space. You're going to be a meme forever. Karen's eye twitched. A car honked. Her Uber. Jake chuckled. Hey, don't forget to leave a 5-star review. Karen's face contorted in fury, but she had no words left. She climbed into the car, slammed the door, and sped off, leaving Maplewood gated community behind for good. The neighborhood erupted into cheers. Someone popped champagne. Jake uploaded his final video. HOA Karen, officially gone. Within hours, it had millions of views. As Jake leaned back in his chair, he grinned at the top comment. Somewhere another Karen is being born. The cycle will never end. Jake smirked. Well, guess I'll be ready. Fade to black.